My name is Pauline, and I'm 58 years old. 6 months ago, I lost Frank, my husband of 35 years, leaving me alone in our California home. What my son Michael doesn't know is that Frank left me not just a comfortable pension, but also a beautiful second house in Spain. When Michael started pressuring me to sell our family home, I kept both secrets close to my heart. Last month, Michael sent me a text that read, "Start packing, Mom. The house has been sold." Most mothers would panic. I just smiled, knowing exactly what I needed to do. If you're watching this right now, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for this story about family secrets, hidden assets, and how sometimes keeping quiet is the best revenge when someone tries to control your life. Frank and I met at an art gallery opening in San Francisco in 1987. I was 23, working as an administrative assistant at an architectural firm, and he was 28, an up-and-coming architect with dreams bigger than the buildings he designed. There was something magnetic about Frank, with his wire-rimmed glasses and perpetually tousled dark hair that never quite stayed in place, no matter how much he tried to tame it. "What do you think of this piece?" he asked me, gesturing toward an abstract sculpture that, to be honest, looked like nothing more than twisted metal to my untrained eye. "I think the artist might have been having a bad day," I replied candidly. Frank laughed a deep, genuine laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Finally, someone who speaks the truth. I'm Frank Martinez." "Pauline Watson," I said, shaking his extended hand. That night turned into dinner, which turned into a walk along the bay, which eventually turned into 35 years of marriage, a son, and a life built together brick by brick, just like the houses Frank designed. Our home in the hills outside of San Diego was Frank's masterpiece. He designed it himself when Michael was just 3 years old, incorporating elements that would grow with our family. Large windows that captured the California sunlight, an open floor plan that allowed us to keep an eye on Michael as he played while we cooked dinner, and a series of outdoor spaces that blurred the line between inside and out. "A house should breathe with its occupants," Frank always said. "It should expand when you need space and embrace you when you need comfort." And our house did exactly that. The living room, with its vaulted ceiling and stone fireplace, was where we gathered on chilly evenings. Michael sprawled on the floor with his toys, while Frank and I sat on the sofa discussing our days. The kitchen, with its large island and professional-grade stove, was where Frank channeled his Spanish heritage, teaching Michael how to make authentic paella on Sunday afternoons. "The secret is the saffron," he'd explain, allowing Michael to carefully drop the precious red strands into the bubbling rice. "Just a pinch, but it transforms everything." We lived comfortably, though never extravagantly. Frank's architectural firm was successful enough to provide us with a good life, but he was always conservative with money. "It's not about what you earn," he would tell Michael. "It's about what you save and how you use it." Michael seemed to absorb these lessons throughout his childhood. He was a studious, thoughtful boy who excelled in mathematics and showed an early interest in his father's blueprints and models. We assumed he might follow Frank into architecture, but as he entered his teen years, his interests shifted. "Real estate is where the real money is, Dad," 16-year-old Michael declared over dinner one evening. "Why design houses for other people when you could be buying and selling them yourself?" Frank exchanged a glance with me across the table. "There's more to life than making money, son. There's creation, there's legacy, There's purpose. But Michael had already set his sights on a different path. After graduating from UCLA with a business degree, he moved to New York and began working for a high-end real estate brokerage, selling multi-million-dollar apartments to the city's elite. We were proud of his ambition, even if it wasn't the direction we had envisioned. It was in New York that Michael met Jessica, a marketing executive for a luxury brand with expensive tastes and a calculating gaze that always seemed to be assessing the value of everything and everyone around her. From the moment Frank and I met her at their engagement dinner, we sensed that Jessica saw Michael not just as a partner, but as a ticket to the lavish lifestyle she coveted. "Your son has such potential," she told us over cocktails, her red lacquered nails wrapped around her glass. "I've been helping him network with the right people. In this business, connections are everything." After their wedding, our relationship with Michael began to change. The phone calls became less frequent, the visits home rare and brief. When they did visit, Jessica would walk through our home with a critical eye, making thinly veiled comments about the charming retro vibe or how certain areas could be updated to increase resale value. Frank took it in stride, but I could see the hurt in his eyes when Michael brushed off his father's stories or cut short family traditions to accommodate Jessica's social schedule. "He's building his own life now," Frank would say, but I knew he missed the close bond they once shared. Meanwhile, Frank's love affair with Spain continued to flourish. He had studied abroad in Barcelona during college and had worked for a year at an architectural firm in Madrid before returning to the States. Spain had captured his heart with its rich history, vibrant culture, and architectural wonders that blended Moorish Gothic and modern influences. "Spain is in my blood," he would say, referring to his father's Spanish ancestry. "When I'm there, I feel like I'm home in a way that's different from anywhere else." For our 30th anniversary, Frank surprised me with a 2-week trip to Spain. We explored Barcelona and Madrid, but it was the small coastal village of Nerja, with its whitewashed buildings and breathtaking views of the Mediterranean, that truly captivated us. On our last night there, over dinner at a small restaurant overlooking the sea, Frank reached across the table and took my hand. "I have something to show you tomorrow," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "Something I've been working on for a while." The next morning, he led me through the winding streets of the village up a hill to a small white house with blue shutters and a terracotta roof. A riot of bougainvillea cascaded over the garden wall, and from the terrace, the Mediterranean stretched to the horizon like a sheet of blue glass. "Welcome home," Frank said, pulling a key from his pocket. I stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean?" "I bought it," he admitted, 6 months ago. "I've been renovating it secretly, working with a local contractor. This is our place, Pauline. Our little piece of Spain." I was speechless. The house was small, but perfect, with 2 bedrooms, a cozy living area, with a fireplace and that magnificent terrace. Inside, Frank had combined traditional Spanish elements with modern comforts, creating a space that was both authentic and livable. "But how, when?" I finally managed to ask. Frank explained that he'd been setting aside money for years in a separate investment account, specifically for this purpose. He'd researched Spanish property laws, worked with an international real estate attorney, and handled all the details without ever hinting at his plan. "I wanted it to be a complete surprise," he said. "A place that's just for us, where we can come and disconnect from everything else." And that's exactly what it became. Over the next 5 years, we spent every vacation and many long weekends at our Spanish hideaway. We made friends in the village, became regulars at the local cafe, and slowly, word by word, improved our Spanish. We never told Michael about the house, partly because it was our special retreat, and partly because Frank feared Jessica would somehow turn it into a networking opportunity, or worse, a property to be monetized. Some things aren't meant to be shared on Instagram, Frank would say, referring to Jessica's habit of documenting every aspect of her curated lifestyle online. Those years were some of the happiest of our marriage. In Spain, Frank seemed younger, more carefree. His shoulders would visibly relax as soon as we arrived, and his laughter came more easily there. We talked about potentially retiring to Nerja someday, spending our golden years overlooking the Mediterranean, sipping wine on our terrace. But fate had other plans. Just after his 63rd birthday, Frank suffered a stroke while working late at his office. The emergency surgery was successful, but the follow-up MRI revealed a glioblastoma, an aggressive brain tumor that had been silently growing for months. The prognosis was grim, 6 months to a year with treatment. "Make it count," Frank told me from his hospital bed, his voice weaker, but his spirit undiminished. "Whatever time we have left, let's make it count." The day Frank received his diagnosis remains etched in my memory with painful clarity. We sat side by side in Dr. Harrington's office, hands clasped so tightly I could feel Frank's wedding ring pressing into my fingers. The doctor spoke about treatment options, survival rates, and quality of life measures, but all I could focus on was the gentle squeeze Frank gave my hand when the words 6 months to a year fell like stones into the quiet room. On the drive home, Frank was the one who broke our stunned silence. "I want to go to Spain," he said simply, "as soon as I'm strong enough after the initial treatments. I want to see our house one more time." I nodded, unable to speak past the knot in my throat. Of course he would want to go to the place that had brought him so much joy. The next 6 months became a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, and radiation treatments. Frank approached his illness with the same methodical attention to detail he'd brought to his architectural projects, researching treatment protocols, interviewing specialists, and tracking every medication and side effect in a leather-bound notebook. Through it all, he maintained a stoicism that both amazed and frustrated me. Only at night, when he thought I was asleep, would I sometimes hear the muffled sounds of his tears, his body shaking silently beside me, as he finally allowed himself to grieve for the future we were losing. Michael flew in from New York 3 times during those early months. The first visit was the longest, nearly a week, and I was touched by his obvious concern for his father. He sat at Frank's bedside, leafed through old photo albums, and even managed to make Frank laugh with stories about particularly eccentric clients. But by the 3rd visit, the demands of Jessica and his job began to pull him away. He spent more time on phone calls than at the hospital, and I overheard him telling Jessica, "It's depressing here. I can't wait to get back to normal life." Between Frank's 2nd and 3rd chemo rounds, when his body had temporarily rallied, we made our journey to Spain. It was more challenging than our previous trips, with wheelchairs, at airports' medication schedules to maintain, and a constant awareness of Frank's diminishing energy. But the moment we arrived at our little house in Nerja, something changed in him. "This is what peace feels like," he said, as we sat on the terrace that first evening, watching the sun sink into the Mediterranean. Remember this moment, Pauline. We spent 2 precious weeks there. Frank was too weak to explore the village, as we once had, but our neighbors came to us, bringing homemade dishes and sitting with us on the terrace. They spoke in slow, careful Spanish, so Frank could follow, treated his illness with a matter-of-fact compassion that avoided pity and filled our small house with warmth and life. One afternoon, when Frank was napping, I found myself alone with Magdalena, our closest neighbor, an elegant woman in her 70s who had lost her own husband years before. "Your husband," she said in her accented English. "He loves this place with his soul." "Yes," I agreed. "It's special to both of us." She patted my hand. "When my Antonio died, I found that being in the place he loved most kept him close to me. Remember this when your time comes." I couldn't speak, could only nod, as tears filled my eyes. It was the first time anyone had spoken so directly about the inevitability of Frank's death, and somehow, coming from Magdalena, it wasn't cruel, but honest and strangely comforting. Back in California, as Frank's condition deteriorated, he began putting his affairs in order. He met several times with Andrew Klein, his longtime friend and attorney, often asking for privacy during these discussions. I respected his need to handle certain matters alone, though it left me with a lingering anxiety about what would happen after he was gone. One evening, about 4 months after his diagnosis, Frank asked me to sit with him in his study. He looked frailer than ever, his once robust frame diminished by illness, but his eyes were clear and determined. "Pauline," he began, "I need to talk to you about what happens next." He explained that he had set up a trust that would provide for me after his death. Our California home was paid off and would be mine outright. There was a life insurance policy that would cover any immediate expenses after his passing, and a pension that would ensure I could maintain our standard of living. "And then there's Spain," he continued, his voice softening. "The house in Nerja is fully paid for, and in both our names. The property taxes and maintenance costs are modest and can easily be covered by the pension income." I started to speak, but he held up a hand. "There's something else, something important. I don't want Michael to know about the Spanish house or the full extent of the pension. Not yet." I frowned, confused. "Why not?" Frank sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I've watched how Jessica influences him, how their values have shifted. They measure everything in dollars and status. If they knew about the pension and the house in Spain, they might see them as assets to be leveraged or liquidated, not as the safety net and sanctuary I intended." "But he's our son," I protested. "Shouldn't he know what you've provided?" "Michael will be fine," Frank assured me. "The trust includes provisions for him as well. But I want you protected, Pauline. I want you to have choices and security that are yours alone." He reached for my hand. "Promise me you'll keep this between us, at least until you're certain Michael would respect my intentions." Though it troubled me to keep such significant secrets from our only child, I promised Frank I would honor his wishes. I told only my younger sister, Eleanor, who lived in Oregon, knowing I would need at least one confidant in the difficult days to come. Frank died at home 2 months later, on a clear autumn morning, with sunlight streaming through the windows of our bedroom. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath, a peaceful release after weeks of increasing pain and medication-induced confusion. His final coherent words to me had been, "Remember Spain, remember joy." The funeral was held at the small, non-denominational chapel where we'd occasionally attended services over the years. I was touched by how many people came from colleagues and clients to our longtime neighbors and friends. Frank had touched many lives with his kindness and integrity. Michael and Jessica flew in the day before the service and stayed at a hotel rather than at the house, claiming they didn't want to intrude on my grief. They remained for just 2 days afterward, Jessica constantly checking her watch and making remarks about flights and important meetings awaiting them in New York. As they prepared to leave, Michael hugged me awkwardly in the driveway. "We'll talk soon about next steps, Mom. You shouldn't be rattling around in this big house by yourself. Jessica and I have some ideas." I nodded noncommittally, watching them drive away in their rented luxury car, feeling a complex mix of love for my son and wariness about the ideas he and Jessica might have for my future. That night, alone in the home Frank and I had shared for decades, I pulled out the folder he had given me, containing information about the Spanish house. Inside were property documents, utility account details, and contact information for our neighbors and the local property manager who checked on the house when we were away. There was also an envelope with my name written in Frank's distinctive architectural lettering. Inside was a letter he must have written during those private meetings with Andrew. "My beloved Pauline, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're facing a future we didn't get to share. I'm so sorry to leave you alone. Know that loving you has been the great privilege of my life. Our house in Nerja is yours to use, however brings you the most comfort. Stay there for a while if you need to heal. Live there permanently if California holds too many memories, or keep it as a retreat, a place to remember the joy we found together. As for Michael, I hope someday he'll find his way back to the values we tried to teach him. Money and status are poor substitutes for connection and purpose. When you feel the time is right, share with him what I've provided. But trust your instincts and remember that your security and happiness must come first. All my love, always, Frank." I folded the letter carefully and held it to my chest, allowing myself to cry freely for the first time since the funeral. That night, I made a decision. I would respect Frank's wishes and keep our Spanish sanctuary a secret until I was confident Michael would understand its true value. Little did I know how soon that resolve would be tested. 2 weeks after the funeral, the calls from Michael began. Initially, they seemed like standard check-ins, his voice carrying a practiced tone of concern that didn't quite mask his impatience. "How are you holding up, Mom?" he would ask, barely pausing before launching into, "Jessica and I were talking, and we think you should start considering your options for the future." At first, I deflected these conversations, explaining that I needed time to adjust to life without Frank. "I'm still sorting through his things," I would say, "still figuring out my new normal." But Michael was persistent, and with each call, his suggestions became more specific and pressured. "That house is way too big for one person," he said during our third conversation. "The property taxes alone must be eating into your savings. And the maintenance, Dad always handled all of that. I'm managing fine," I assured him, though in truth, the silence of the house was sometimes overwhelming. Frank left everything very organized. But think about the future, Mom. What happens when the water heater breaks or the roof needs replacing? Those are huge expenses for someone on a fixed income. I nearly corrected him about my fixed income, nearly mentioned the substantial pension that Frank had arranged, but something held me back. Frank's warning echoed in my mind, and I found myself playing along with Michael's assumptions about my financial vulnerability. "I'll cross those bridges when I come to them," I said instead. By the 1-month mark after Frank's death, Michael's calls had a new focus: senior living communities. Jessica found this amazing place in Arizona, he enthused. It's like a resort, Mom. Pool, golf course, organized activities. And the best part is they handle everything from home maintenance to medical care as your needs change. Arizona, I repeated, genuinely surprised. Michael, my entire life is here in California. My friends, my volunteer work at the library, everything. But you'd be making new friends, he countered. People your own age with similar interests. And Arizona is much more affordable than California. Your money would stretch further there. Again, that assumption about my limited finances. I began to understand why Frank had been so insistent on discretion. One evening, I received a particularly concerning call. Michael's voice had a forced cheerfulness that immediately put me on guard. Great news, Mom, Jessica and I are coming to visit next weekend. We want to help you start organizing the house, maybe clear out some of Dad's things. It's the first step in moving forward. The idea of Michael and Jessica going through Frank's belongings, assessing their value, deciding what should be kept or discarded, made my stomach twist. That's not necessary, I said quickly. I'm doing that at my own pace. It's been over a month, Mom. You can't just leave everything as it was when Dad was alive. It's not healthy. I'll be the judge of what's healthy for me, I replied, an edge entering my voice. There was a pause. Then Michael said, his tone suddenly conciliatory. Of course, we just want to help. We'll still come visit, but no pressure about the house, okay? I agreed, though, with significant reservations. When they arrived that Friday, Jessica strode into my home like she was conducting a property assessment, which in retrospect she probably was. Her eyes scanned every room, lingering on the artwork Frank had collected over the years, the custom furniture he had designed for specific spaces. This place has such potential, she remarked, running her hand along the quartz countertop in the kitchen. The bones are good, but it could really shine with some updates. A full renovation would send the value soaring. I noticed she didn't say your home, but this place, as if it were already disconnected from me, just a property waiting for transformation. During dinner, Michael steered the conversation toward my finances. Have you gone through all of Dad's papers yet? He asked, attempting casualness. Andrew Klein is helping me with that, I replied, referring to Frank's attorney. Lawyers charge by the hour, Jessica interjected. Michael could help you for free. He deals with property and finances every day. I smiled tightly. Andrew was Frank's friend for 30 years. He's being very generous with his time. Later that night, after I'd gone to bed, I heard them moving around downstairs. Quietly, I got up and stood at the top of the stairs listening. They were in Frank's study, opening drawers, shuffling papers. There has to be more, I heard Jessica whisper. A guy as careful as Frank wouldn't leave his wife with just a paid-off house and a small insurance policy. Maybe that's really it, Michael replied. Dad was never flashy about money. Nobody squirrels away cash for decades in architecture without having investments somewhere, Jessica insisted. We just need to find the accounts. I retreated to my room, heart pounding. The next morning, I pretended I hadn't overheard their nocturnal searching, but I watched them more carefully, noting how Jessica photographed various documents when she thought I wasn't looking. When they left on Sunday, Michael hugged me with renewed affection. We'll figure everything out, Mom. Don't worry about a thing. As their car disappeared down the driveway, I immediately called Eleanor. They were hunting for money, I told my sister, going through Frank's papers like detectives. Frank was right to be cautious, Eleanor replied. You need to secure any documents related to the pension and the Spanish property. Keep them somewhere they can't access. The next day, I opened a safe deposit box at my bank and placed all the sensitive documents inside, including the keys to the house in Nerja. Then I called Andrew Klein and updated him on the situation. "Unfortunately, I'm not surprised," Andrew said. "Michael called me yesterday, asking about your financial situation. I reminded him about attorney-client privilege, of course." "What exactly does he want?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. Andrew sighed. "To be blunt, Pauline, I think he's counting on an inheritance. The real estate market in New York has taken some hits lately, and from what Frank told me before he passed, Michael and Jessica are overextended financially. They live beyond their means." This matched what I'd observed on Jessica's Instagram account, which showcased their seemingly luxurious lifestyle, expensive restaurants, designer clothes, exclusive events. But there had been fewer posts lately, and I'd noticed Michael's increasing anxiety. During our calls, the way he frequently checked his phone, as if awaiting important news. "What should I do?" I asked Andrew. "For now, just be cautious. Frank structured everything to protect you. The house is yours, the pension is yours, and of course, the property in Spain is safely under both your names. Michael can make suggestions, but he can't force you to do anything with your assets." I thanked Andrew for his candor and hung up, feeling both relieved and saddened. My son was hoping to use my presumed vulnerability to solve his own financial problems. It was a bitter realization, one that confirmed Frank's foresight in keeping certain aspects of our finances private. Over the next few months, I maintained the pretense that I was just getting by financially. When Michael called with concerns about how I would manage home repairs or property taxes, I assured him I was being careful with my limited resources. When he sent links to senior communities or smaller houses in less expensive neighborhoods, I thanked him politely, but remained non-committal. Meanwhile, I quietly consulted with Andrew about Spanish residency requirements and international banking, preparing for a contingency I hoped I wouldn't need, but increasingly suspected might become necessary. Frank had always said, "Hope for the best, plan for the worst," when approaching any project, and I took that advice to heart now. Then came the call that changed everything. "Mom," Michael began without preamble, "I've been doing some research on your behalf, and I've found a fantastic opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" I asked, immediately wary. "The housing market in your area is red hot right now. Properties like yours are selling within days, often above asking price. I've had a colleague in San Diego run some numbers, and we think we could get at least $1.5 million for your house in its current condition. With strategic renovations, maybe closer to 1.8. The casual way he discussed selling my home, the home Frank had designed and built for our family, made my blood run cold. "I'm not interested in selling," I said firmly. "Just hear me out," Michael pressed. "You sell the house, invest the majority of the proceeds, and use a portion to buy a comfortable condo or townhouse. No maintenance worries, lower taxes, and you'd still have a substantial nest egg for your future needs." "And who would handle these investments?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I would, of course. Real estate is my expertise, Mom. I could help you get a much better return than whatever savings account or CD you're using now." I took a deep breath. "Michael, this is my home. It's where your father and I built our lives, where we raised you. I have no intention of selling it." There was a long pause. Then Michael's voice took on an edge I'd never heard before. "With all due respect, Mom, I don't think you understand the current market dynamics. This could be a limited window of opportunity. Waiting even a few months could mean losing hundreds of thousands in potential value. I appreciate your concern, I said, struggling to keep my voice level. But my decision is final. The house is not for sale. The conversation ended shortly after, with Michael barely disguising his frustration. I sat in Frank's study afterward, trembling, with a mixture of anger and disbelief. My son had just tried to pressure me into selling my home so he could control the proceeds. I should have known it wouldn't end there. 3 days after my firm refusal to sell the house, I received a call from Jessica. This was unusual. She rarely contacted me directly, preferring to let Michael handle family communications. "Pauline," she began, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth. "I wanted to check in on you. Michael told me about your conversation, and I'm worried you might have misunderstood his intentions." "I understood perfectly," I replied, keeping my tone neutral but unyielding. "We're just concerned about you," she continued. "That house must hold so many memories of Frank. It can't be easy being surrounded by reminders every day." The calculated emotional manipulation was so transparent, it was almost insulting. "Actually, I find comfort in those reminders," I said. Jessica changed tactics. "Michael has been under tremendous stress lately. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but we're going through some financial challenges." "Oh," I feigned surprise. "The market in New York has been brutal. Michael lost 2 major clients last month, and we had to put our apartment renovation on hold. We're even considering downsizing." She paused, then added in a lower voice, "We're 3 months behind on our mortgage." I remained silent, waiting. "That's why he's so eager to help you with selling the house," she continued. "He sees it as a way to solve problems for both of you. You wouldn't have the burden of maintaining such a large property, and the commission would help us get back on our feet." There it was, the real motivation laid bare. My house wasn't just an asset they thought I should liquidate for my own good. It was a potential lifeline for their financial troubles. "I'm sorry to hear about your difficulties," I said carefully. "But selling my home isn't the solution. I'm sure Michael's skills will help him rebuild his client base soon." Jessica's voice hardened. "You don't understand the pressure we're under. Michael has been working 70-hour weeks trying to turn things around. He's doing it all for our future, for the family." "And I respect that," I replied. "But Frank and I worked hard for decades to create this home and pay it off. It's my security." "But you don't need all that security," she burst out, abandoning her veneer of concern. "You're one person in a 4-bedroom house. Do you know what properties like that are worth in California right now? It's selfish to hold on to it when the money could be helping your son." I was momentarily stunned by her audacity. "I think we've said all we need to say on this subject, Jessica. Please tell Michael I love him, but my decision stands." I ended the call before she could respond, my hands shaking as I set down the phone. The conversation had confirmed my worst fears about their intentions and validated Frank's decision to keep certain assets private. The next 2 weeks brought a barrage of increasingly aggressive attempts to change my mind. Michael sent emails with links to news articles about the impending housing market correction and the risks of property ownership for seniors. Jessica forwarded listings for condos and retirement communities, all with notes about how perfect they would be for me. Then the in-person visits began. Michael started showing up unannounced, sometimes with a real estate agent in tow, whom he'd just happened to be meeting in the area. "While we're here, maybe we could get a professional opinion on the house's value," he'd suggest, as if the idea had just occurred to him. I found myself growing anxious every time the doorbell rang, dreading another confrontation or manipulation attempt. I began screening my calls, answering only when I recognized the number as a friend or family member I actually wanted to speak with. One afternoon, I returned from grocery shopping to find a "For Sale by Owner" sign planted in my front yard. Furious, I pulled it out immediately and called Michael. "Did you put a "For Sale" sign in my yard without my permission?" I demanded when he answered. "Just testing the waters, Mom," he replied, not even attempting to deny it. "We've already had 3 calls from interested buyers." "Take me off your waters testing list immediately," I snapped. "This is my property, not yours." "Actually," Michael said, his voice taking on a smug tone that made my skin crawl, "I've been consulting with a lawyer about this. Since Dad's death, there could be an argument made for me having a partial interest in the house as an heir." "That's not how your father set things up," I told him, trying to keep the alarm from my voice. "The house transferred directly to me upon his death. Andrew Klein handled all the paperwork." "Klein is old school," Michael dismissed. "There are newer interpretations of property law that could apply here. My attorney thinks we have a case." I hung up and immediately called Andrew, relaying Michael's threat. "He's bluffing," Andrew assured me after hearing the details. "Frank was meticulous about the estate planning. The house is indisputably yours, Pauline. Michael has no legal claim to it whatsoever." Though relieved, I remained uneasy. The fact that my son would even consider such a tactic represented a fundamental breakdown in our relationship, a violation of trust that wouldn't be easily repaired. The situation reached its breaking point a week later, when I returned from having lunch with a friend to find Michael and Jessica in my house, accompanied by a man they introduced as an interior designer. "We're just getting some preliminary ideas for updates that would maximize the resale value," Michael explained, as if this were a perfectly normal thing to do in someone else's home without permission. "How did you get in?" I asked, noticing that there was no sign of forced entry. Michael held up a key. "I still have my old one from high school. Never turned it in." The casual invasion of my privacy, the assumption that they had the right to bring strangers into my home and make plans for its improvement, was the final straw. "All of you need to leave immediately," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Michael, give me that key." "Mom, you're overreacting," he began, but I cut him off. "Now, Michael, and if you ever enter my home without explicit permission, again I will call the police and report it as trespassing." Jessica gasped dramatically. "You would call the police on your own son?" "If my son doesn't respect my boundaries, yes," I replied, holding out my hand for the key. Reluctantly, Michael placed it in my palm. "We're trying to help you," he insisted as they gathered their things. "Why can't you see that?" After they left, I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed that same day. I also installed a simple security system with door sensors and cameras, another expense that contradicted the financial hardship I was supposedly experiencing. That evening, I received a text from Michael that made my blood run cold. "I've found a buyer willing to pay cash for the house. Start packing, Mom. The house has been sold. We close in 30 days. I stared at the message in disbelief. He couldn't possibly have sold a house he didn't own. It had to be another pressure tactic, a bluff to force my hand. But the conviction in his message suggested he believed he had the authority to make this decision. I forwarded the text to Andrew, who called me immediately. "This is beyond the pale," he said, anger evident in his normally measured voice. He has absolutely no right to sell your property. Any contract he's signed is invalid on its face. What should I do? I asked, feeling cornered in my own home. Don't engage directly. Let me handle the legal response. But Pauline, he paused. It might be time to consider that contingency plan we discussed. Just temporarily, until this situation cools down. After hanging up, I sat in Frank's study, surrounded by his books and drawings, and made the hardest decision of my life since his death. The next morning, I called Eleanor. I think I need to go to Spain, I told her. Just for a while. Are you sure? She asked, concern evident in her voice. No, I admitted. But I can't stay here constantly, defending my home from my own son. I need space to think, to plan my next steps, without this constant pressure. Eleanor, always practical, helped me organize my thoughts. What will you tell Michael? Nothing yet. I decided. If he thinks I've left the country, he'll just see it as an opportunity to move forward with his plans for the house. I need to be strategic about this. Over the next week, I quietly prepared for my departure. I arranged for my mail to be forwarded to Eleanor's address in Oregon. I contacted our trusted neighbors, the Hendersons, explaining that I would be traveling for an extended period and asking them to keep an eye on the house. I packed essential documents, clothes, and a few cherished mementos that I couldn't bear to leave behind, including several of Frank's smaller architectural drawings and the wedding photo that had sat on our bedside table for 35 years. The day before my scheduled flight, I received another text from Michael. The buyers are getting anxious. They've agreed to give you 60 days to find a new place, but they need a firm move-out date. I'll be by tomorrow to discuss details and help you start packing. I didn't respond. Instead, I finished my preparations and left early the next morning, long before Michael would arrive, expecting to find me acquiescent and ready to begin dismantling my life. As the plane lifted off from San Diego International Airport, bound first for New York and then Madrid, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: grief at leaving the home Frank and I had shared, anger at being driven away by my own son's greed, and underneath it all, a small but growing sense of anticipation at returning to Nerja, to the sanctuary Frank had created for us. Remember Spain, he had told me. Remember joy. It was time to do exactly that. The moment the taxi dropped me at the blue gate of our Spanish house, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The Mediterranean glittered in the distance, visible over the tops of whitewashed buildings, cascading down the hillside. The bougainvillea had grown even more abundant since our last visit, draping over the garden wall in a riot of magenta blooms. "Señora Martinez," a voice called, and I turned to see Magdalena, hurrying toward me, arms outstretched. Our neighbor's warm embrace brought tears to my eyes, the first human contact that had felt genuinely caring since Frank's death. "We did not know you were coming," she said, helping me with my suitcase. "But your house is ready. I have kept it clean, just as you asked in your emails." Inside the small house was exactly as we had left it, though freshly dusted and aired. Frank's books still lined the shelves in the living room. His favorite coffee mug still hung from a hook in the kitchen, and the painting of the San Diego coastline we had brought as a reminder of home still hung over the fireplace. I moved through the rooms, slowly, trailing my fingers over familiar surfaces, allowing memories to wash over me. Here was the couch where Frank had fallen asleep during afternoon siestas, the desk where he had sketched preliminary designs for projects back home, the terrace where we had watched countless sunsets over the Mediterranean. It feels like he's still here, I said to Magdalena, who had busied herself making coffee in the kitchen. Of course he is, she replied simply. In Spain, we understand that the dead never really leave us. They just step into another room for a while. That first evening, sitting on the terrace with a glass of the local wine, watching the lights of fishing boats appear on the darkening sea, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me since Frank's diagnosis. Here, thousands of miles from the house that had become a battleground, I could think clearly about what I wanted for my future. The next morning, I began the practical tasks necessary for a longer stay. I visited the local bank where Frank had set up an account for house expenses, confirming that everything was in order and arranging for a portion of my pension to be deposited there monthly. I met with Javier, the property manager, who had looked after the house in our absence, thanking him for his care and discussing some minor repairs that were needed. Most importantly, I consulted with Maria Lorca, a local attorney who specialized in expatriate affairs. Frank had worked with her when purchasing the property, and she remembered us fondly. I was so sorry to hear of your husband's passing, she said in her excellent English, inviting me to sit in her small office overlooking the town square. How can I assist you now? I explained my situation, the need to secure my Spanish property, the pension arrangements, and most immediately, the potential for an extended stay in Spain. As an American citizen, you can stay in Spain for up to 90 days, without a visa, Maria explained. But if you wish to stay longer, we should apply for a residence permit. Given that you own property here and have sufficient income, it should be straightforward. There is also the Golden Visa program for significant property owners, which might apply in your case. We spent the next hour discussing options, requirements, and timelines. By the time I left her office, I had a clear plan and a list of documents I would need to gather. Back at the house, I checked my phone for the first time since arriving in Spain. There were 7 missed calls from Michael, 3 from Jessica, and a flurry of increasingly frantic text messages. Mom, where are you? I came by the house and you weren't there. The neighbors said you're traveling. When were you going to tell me? This is incredibly irresponsible. The buyers are expecting to close in 3 weeks. Mom, call me. This is serious. The final message, sent just an hour earlier, read, I'm contacting the police if I don't hear from you by tomorrow. This isn't a game. I took a deep breath, then composed a brief email rather than responding directly to the texts. Michael, I am safe and well, just taking some time away to think. The house in California is not for sale. Any arrangements you have made with potential buyers are invalid and unauthorized. Andrew Klein has my power of attorney in my absence and will handle any legal matters that arise. Mom, I sent a separate email to Andrew updating him on my whereabouts, which I knew he would keep confidential, and asking him to manage any issues that might arise with the California house. His response came quickly. Pauline, glad to hear you're taking some time for yourself. Don't worry about the house or Michael's threats. I've already sent a formal letter to the buyers he claims to have found, informing them that any sale arranged by Michael is fraudulent. I've also had my associate check the county records daily to ensure no documents are filed without your knowledge. Take as long as you need in Spain. Everything here is under control. Andrew, with those immediate concerns addressed, I allowed myself to fully settle into life in Nerja. Each day took on a pleasant rhythm. Coffee on the terrace in the morning, a walk through the town or along the beach, lunch at one of the small local restaurants, an afternoon rest during the hottest hours, then dinner and evenings spent reading or chatting with neighbors who stopped by. Magdalena introduced me to her circle of friends, a mix of Spanish locals and expatriates from various European countries. They welcomed me warmly, inviting me to their homes for meals, including me in their outings to neighboring towns, and gradually helping me improve my rudimentary Spanish. "You are blooming," Magdalena observed one evening, about 3 weeks after my arrival. "When you came, you looked like a flower without water. Now you have color in your cheeks again." She was right. The Mediterranean sun, the relaxed pace of life, and the distance from the conflict with Michael had restored something in me that I hadn't even realized was missing. For the first time since Frank's death, I wasn't just surviving. I was beginning to live again. One morning, as I was enjoying my coffee and the view, my phone rang. The international number indicated it was from the U.S., but it wasn't one I recognized. Hesitantly, I answered. "Mom." Michael's voice was a mixture of relief and anger. "Finally, do you have any idea how worried I've been? I sent you an email explaining that I was safe," I replied calmly. "An email. After disappearing without a word, I've been calling hospitals, checking with the police. I even contacted the State Department. I'm sorry you were worried," I said, meaning it despite everything. He was still my son, and causing him genuine distress hadn't been my intention. But I needed some space after what happened. "Where are you?" he demanded. "The neighbors won't tell me anything except that you're traveling. Are you with Aunt Eleanor?" I hesitated, then decided on honesty, at least about my location. "I'm in Spain, Michael." "Spain?" He sounded genuinely confused. "What are you doing in Spain? How are you affording that?" "I'm staying at a small house your father and I own here," I said, watching a fishing boat move across the horizon. "We bought it several years ago." There was a long silence on the line. When Michael spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming cautious, calculating. "Dad bought a house in Spain. I had no idea." "There's a lot you don't know," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "What else don't I know, Mom?" he asked, the familiar edge of entitlement creeping back into his voice. "What else was Dad hiding?" "Your father wasn't hiding anything," I corrected him. "He was protecting our future, ensuring I would be secure after he was gone." Which, as it turns out, was a wise precaution. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm aware that you tried to sell my house without my consent, that you brought potential buyers into my home, that you've been pressuring me to liquidate assets for your benefit." "That's not fair," he protested. "I was trying to help you downsize, to secure your future." "My future is secure, Michael. Frank made sure of that with this house in Spain and the pension you know nothing about." Another silence, longer this time. I could almost hear the calculations happening in his mind. "How much is the pension?" he finally asked. I laughed, a short, sad sound. "That's your question, not, 'I'm sorry for trying to sell your house,' or 'I should have respected your wishes.' I just want to understand the full picture," he said defensively. "The full picture is that your father and I worked hard our entire lives, saved carefully, and made plans for our retirement. Plans that included this house in Spain, where we hope to spend half the year. The pension is substantial enough that I'll never have to worry about finances again. The California house is paid for, and legally mine alone. And none of these assets are available to solve whatever financial problems you and Jessica have created for yourselves." I heard him inhale sharply. "So, that's it. You're just going to live in Spain now and abandon everything back home. What about me? What about your grandson? When Jessica and I decide to have kids?" The emotional manipulation was so transparent, It almost made me laugh again. I haven't decided about living arrangements long term, I told him honestly. But I do know I won't return to a situation where my own son tries to sell my house out from under me. I've already committed to these buyers, Mom, he said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. They've started the loan process. I'll be legally liable if the sale falls through. That's unfortunate, I replied, finding strength I didn't know I possessed. But it's a consequence of your own actions, Michael. You had no right to sell property that isn't yours. You can't do this to me, he said, anger replacing desperation. Dad would never have wanted you to turn your back on your own son. It was a low blow, invoking Frank that way. And it stung. But I thought of Frank's letter, of his concerns, about Michael's values and priorities, and stood firm. Your father wanted me to be secure and happy, I said. Right now, that means staying in Spain, away from the pressure and manipulation. When you're ready to respect my choices and boundaries, we can talk about rebuilding our relationship. After I hung up, I sat on the terrace for a long time, watching the sea and processing the conversation. I had stood up to Michael more firmly than ever before, drawing boundaries that should have been established long ago. It hurt to be at such odds with my only child, but I also felt a newfound respect for myself. That evening, I wrote a long email to Andrew, updating him on the conversation with Michael and asking for his continued vigilance regarding the California property. His reply was reassuring and included an unexpected piece of news. Michael came to my office today, demanding to see Frank's will and all documentation related to your assets. I reminded him that these matters are confidential and that he has no legal right to the information. He became quite agitated, threatening legal action and claiming elder abuse. I made it clear that any such claims would be vigorously defended. He left without further incident, but I wanted you to be aware. So Michael was now claiming elder abuse. The absurdity would have been comical if it weren't so painful. My son, who had tried to pressure me into selling my home against my wishes, who had entered my house without permission, who had caused so much stress that I felt compelled to leave the country, was now positioning himself as my protector. The irony was bitter, but it reinforced my decision to remain in Spain for the time being. Here, surrounded by new friends, in the beauty of the Mediterranean coast, I could heal from both the loss of Frank and the painful revelation of who my son had become. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at the photo of Frank I'd brought with me, his smile as bright and genuine as the day it was taken. You were right, I whispered to his image, about everything, and for the first time, I felt truly at peace with the choices I was making. The weeks that followed brought a flood of communications from Michael, emails, texts, voicemails, each alternating between anger manipulation and occasional glimpses of genuine concern. I responded selectively, maintaining firm boundaries while keeping the door open for eventual reconciliation. Meanwhile, my life in Nerja expanded in unexpected and joyful ways. With Maria Lorca's expert guidance, I applied for a Spanish residence permit, gathering the necessary documentation to prove financial stability and health coverage. The process would take time, but the initial steps went smoothly. Magdalena introduced me to the local expat community, a diverse group of retirees from Britain, Germany, Sweden, and even a few fellow Americans. Among them was Edward, a widowed former professor from Boston, who had moved to Spain after losing his wife to the same type of brain cancer that had taken Frank. The coincidence was what struck me first. Edward told me over paella at a beachside restaurant. When Magdalena mentioned your husband's diagnosis, I felt an immediate connection. That shared experience creates a kind of shorthand, doesn't it? You don't have to explain the mixture of grief and relief. At the end, the way people look at you with that particular expression of pity. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Or the well-intentioned but painful question, "How are you doing?" As if there's a simple answer to that. Edward became a regular companion, showing me his favorite hiking trails in the nearby mountains and introducing me to local artists and musicians he had befriended during his 5 years in Nerja. There was nothing romantic between us, just the comfortable camaraderie of two people who had experienced similar losses and found themselves rebuilding their lives in a new place. One morning, about 6 weeks after my arrival in Spain, I received a troubling email from the Hendersons, my neighbors in California. "Dear Pauline, we wanted to alert you that there's been some activity at your house. Yesterday, a moving truck arrived, and we observed Michael and several people removing furniture and boxes. When we questioned him, he said you had authorized him to ship some of your belongings to Spain. This didn't align with what you'd told us about keeping an eye on the house, so we thought you should know immediately." With concern, David and Carol Henderson, my heart raced as I read their words. Michael was removing things from my house. Without permission, I immediately called Andrew, who answered despite the early hour in California. "I'll send someone over right away," he assured me after I explained the situation. "And I'll file for an emergency restraining order to prevent further removal of property. Can you send me a list of what's likely being taken?" I spent the next hour compiling a detailed inventory of the most valuable items in the house. Frank's art collection, the antique dining set that had been my grandmother's, the custom furniture Frank had designed. I emailed it to Andrew, along with photos I had on my computer showing the items in situ. By that evening, Andrew called with an update. "We caught them in the act," he said. "The sheriff's deputies arrived while they were loading the truck. Michael claimed you had given verbal permission, but when they asked for documentation, he couldn't provide any. They've secured the house and changed the locks again." "Was anything taken?" I asked anxiously. "Some smaller items may be missing, but the major pieces are all still there. Michael is furious, claiming you've abandoned the property, and that as your son, he has a right to safeguard your possessions." "Safeguard them by taking them where exactly?" Andrew's voice turned grim. "Based on what the movers told my associate, the items were headed for an auction house in Los Angeles. It appears he was planning to sell them, not ship them to you." The betrayal cut deep. My son wasn't just trying to sell my house. He was now attempting to liquidate my possessions, likely to address his own financial problems. It was a violation that went beyond property rights. It struck at the core of trust between parent and child. "What happens now?" I asked. "I've filed for a formal restraining order that would legally bar Michael from entering the property without your explicit written permission. Given what's happened, it should be granted without issue. In the meantime, I've arranged for a security service to monitor the house." After thanking Andrew, I sat on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the Mediterranean gold and purple, trying to process this latest development. The peace I had found in Spain now felt threatened by the ongoing situation in California. Part of me wanted to fly back immediately, to confront Michael, to protect my home and possessions personally. But another part recognized that physical distance was providing valuable perspective and protection from the emotional manipulation that had worn me down before. I was still wrestling with this dilemma the next morning when an unexpected email arrived from Jessica Pauline. "I'm writing without Michael's knowledge. because things have gotten out of control. He's obsessed with recovering what he sees as his rightful inheritance. After yesterday's incident with the sheriff, he's talking about flying to Spain to confront you directly. You should know that our financial situation is worse than he's admitted. We're not just behind on the mortgage. We're facing foreclosure. Michael lost his job 3 months ago and has been pretending to go to work, trying desperately to maintain appearances while looking for new opportunities. The stress has changed him. He's not sleeping, drinking too much, and making increasingly rash decisions. I'm not excusing his behavior toward you, which has been inexcusable. But I thought you should understand the context. He's scared and desperate, and he's fixated on your assets as the solution. I've encouraged him to be honest with you about our situation, but pride has prevented him from admitting the truth. I'm telling you now, because I'm worried about what he might do next. Jessica, the email left me with mixed emotions. On one hand, it confirmed my suspicions about Michael's financial troubles and provided context for his increasingly extreme behavior. On the other hand, it raised new concerns about his potential actions, including the possibility that he might come to Spain uninvited. I forwarded Jessica's email to Andrew, seeking his advice. His response was characteristically measured but direct. If Michael is indeed planning to come to Spain, you might consider this an opportunity rather than a threat. A face-to-face conversation in neutral territory, away from the California house, that's become such a point of contention could potentially de-escalate the situation. However, I would advise meeting in a public place, rather than at your home at least initially. The suggestion made sense, though the prospect of such a confrontation filled me with trepidation. After careful consideration, I decided to reach out to Michael directly. Michael, I've learned about your attempt to remove items from my house and Jessica's concerns about your plans to come to Spain. If you're genuinely interested in resolving our differences, I'm willing to meet and talk. But this must be a conversation based on honesty and respect, not demands or manipulation. If you come to Spain, we can meet at a cafe in Nerja to discuss the situation. Let me know your thoughts. Mom. His reply came within hours. I'll be there on Friday. Send the address. No greeting, no acknowledgement of his actions, no indication of his mindset or intentions. Just a curt confirmation that left me anxious about what to expect. I spent the next 3 days preparing for his arrival, both practically and emotionally. I chose a cafe in the town center, a neutral public space where we could talk without the conversation escalating to uncomfortable levels. I asked Edward if he would sit at a nearby table, not to interfere, but to provide a reassuring presence if needed. And I rehearsed what I wanted to say, the boundaries I needed to establish, and the potential paths forward I could offer. Friday morning dawned clear and bright, the sea a brilliant blue against the whitewashed buildings of Nerja. I arrived at the cafe early, selecting a table with a view of the square where I could watch for Michael's approach. Edward positioned himself discreetly at a table inside visible but not intrusive. At precisely 11 o'clock, I spotted Michael crossing the square. He looked thinner than when I'd last seen him, his normally impeccable appearance slightly disheveled with dark circles under his eyes, confirming Jessica's description of his stressed state. He scanned the outdoor tables, his gaze finally settling on me. For a moment, as he walked toward me, I saw a flash of the little boy he had once been, earnest, open-hearted, eager for approval. Then, his expression hardened, the mask of the driven real estate broker sliding into place. "Hello, Michael," I said, as he sat down across from me. Thank you for coming. He nodded curtly. You didn't give me much choice, did you? Hiding away in Spain, locking me out of the house, calling the sheriff on me. I called the sheriff because you were removing property from my house without permission, I corrected gently. But I didn't ask you here to argue about that. I wanted us to talk honestly about what's happening. A waiter approached, and we paused to order coffee. When he departed, Michael leaned forward, his voice low and intense. What's happening is that you've been hiding assets from me, Mom. A house in Spain, a substantial pension, all while letting me believe you were struggling financially after Dad's death. I didn't let you believe anything, I replied. You assumed, and I chose not to correct those assumptions after you began pressuring me to sell my home and move into senior housing. I was trying to help you. Were you? I asked quietly. Or were you trying to help yourself? His eyes flashed with anger, but before he could respond, the waiter returned with our coffees. I thanked him in Spanish, then turned back to Michael. Jessica told me about your financial situation, I said. The job loss, the mortgage problems. I wish you had been honest with me from the beginning, instead of trying to manipulate me into selling my home. Michael's face flushed embarrassment, competing with anger. Jessica had no right to tell you that. She was worried about you, about what you might do in desperation. He stared down at his coffee shoulders, slumping slightly. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We had everything planned out. The apartment renovation was going to increase its value by 30%. The new position was supposed to come with a significant bonus. Then the market turned, the firm downsized, and suddenly everything fell apart. For the first time, I saw beyond the entitled behavior to the fear driving it. My son, who had always projected confidence and control, was watching his carefully constructed life crumble around him. Why didn't you just tell me you were in trouble? I asked. Why the elaborate schemes to get me to sell the house? He looked up, his expression a mixture of defiance and shame. Would you have helped if I'd asked directly? After all those lectures from Dad about living within your means, about not counting on inheritance. I don't know, I admitted. I might have been reluctant to enable the lifestyle you and Jessica have been pursuing. But I would have listened. I would have tried to help in ways that made sense for everyone, not just by liquidating my home and security. We sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the busy square filling the space between us. Children laughing, vendors calling out the rhythmic sweep of a shopkeeper's broom on the cobblestones. I need to ask you something, I finally said. And I need an honest answer. Were you really going to sell my furniture and art without permission? Items that have been in our family for generations. Michael's gaze dropped again, confirming the truth before he spoke. I was desperate, he whispered. The foreclosure notice came, and Jessica was talking about moving back to her parents' house. I didn't see any other way out. The admission hurt, but his honesty was a small step forward. There are always other ways, Michael. Your father and I faced financial challenges too over the years, but we never resorted to taking what wasn't ours. He nodded slowly. I know. I'm sorry. Everything just spiraled out of control. It was the first genuine apology he'd offered, and though it didn't erase the betrayal, it opened a path toward understanding. I'd like to show you something, I said, making a decision I hadn't planned on when the day began. Would you walk with me? Michael looked surprised, but nodded. I left enough euros on the table to cover our coffees, caught Edward's eye to indicate I was all right, and led Michael through the winding streets of Nerja. We walked in silence, climbing the hill toward the residential area, where my Spanish home waited. When we reached the blue gate with its cascade of bougainvillea, I paused, keys in hand. This is it, I said. "The house your father bought for our retirement, the place where he was happiest, outside of our family home in California." I opened the gate and led him into the small courtyard, fragrant with jasmine and lemon trees. Michael looked around, taking in the modest size and simple beauty of the space. "It's small," he observed, surprise evident in his voice. "We didn't need anything grand," I explained, unlocking the front door. "Just a place that felt like us." Inside, I watched as Michael moved slowly through the rooms, his expression shifting as he absorbed the evidence of his father's presence. Frank's architectural books on the shelves, his sketch pad still open on the desk, his favorite reading chair positioned to catch the afternoon light. "Dad really loved this place," he said softly, picking up a small model building Frank had constructed, one of his creative exercises when inspiration struck. "He did," I confirmed. "We both do." It represented everything we'd worked for: simplicity, beauty, peace. Michael set down the model carefully and turned to me. "I don't understand. If you have all this, why not sell the California house? Why not use that money to help me? There's more than enough space for you here." I sighed, recognizing that despite the momentary connection, Michael still hadn't grasped the fundamental issue. "Because the California house is my home too," I explained patiently. "Because your father designed it for us, built our life there. Because it holds 35 years of memories. And because, frankly, it's mine to decide what happens to not yours." "But I'm your son," he insisted, the sense of entitlement resurfacing. "Doesn't that count for anything?" "Of course it does," I said. "I love you, Michael. That hasn't changed. But being my son doesn't give you the right to make decisions about my property or to pressure me into financial arrangements that benefit you at my expense." I led him to the terrace, where the view of the Mediterranean opened before us, vast and serene. We sat at the small table where I took my morning coffee, the same table where Frank and I had shared countless meals. "Your father was worried about you," I said carefully. "Not just before he died, but for years. He saw how your values were shifting, how money and status were becoming more important to you than relationships and integrity." Michael started to protest, but I held up a hand. "That's why he kept this house and the pension private. Not to deceive you, but to ensure that I would be protected from exactly the kind of pressure you've been applying. He feared that if you knew about these assets, you might see them as resources to be exploited rather than the fruits of a lifetime of hard work and careful planning." The words landed hard. Michael's face flushed, then paled. "Dad thought that little of me. He loved you," I corrected. "But he was realistic about the influence Jessica and your lifestyle were having on your judgment. And, as it turns out, his concerns were justified." We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the shore below. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice small and defeated. "So what happens now? You stay in Spain, I lose my home to foreclosure, and we just, what, pretend we're not family anymore?" I reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the tension in his fingers. "That's not what I want, and I don't think it's what you want either. But we need to establish new terms for our relationship, Michael. Terms based on mutual respect and honesty." He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time since arriving. "What are you proposing?" And that's when I laid out the plan that had been forming in my mind since receiving Jessica's email, a plan that might offer a way forward for both of us. "The California house stays in my name," I began, my voice firm but not unkind. "That's non-negotiable. It represents security and independence that I'm not willing to give up, especially after recent events. Michael nodded reluctantly, his gaze drifting toward the sea before returning to me. I understand. However, I continued, I've been thinking about how we might address your immediate financial crisis while also rebuilding trust between us. The plan I proposed was straightforward. Michael could live in the California house, rent-free for 6 months, giving him time to find new employment and stabilize his finances without the immediate pressure of housing costs. In exchange, he would need to maintain the property properly, respect my belongings, and provide regular updates on his job search and financial progress. This isn't a permanent solution, I emphasized. It's a temporary bridge to help you get back on your feet. After 6 months, we'll reassess based on how things are going. And Jessica, he asked, where does she fit into this arrangement? It was a fair question and one I had carefully